So besides paint and some landscaping work, there was really only one thing left to do on the outside of the not-so-tiny house, and that was to get some gutters installed. And before we get started, I just want to give a quick shout out to Craftsman for sponsoring this video, and stay tuned to learn more about the Craftsman V20 power tools I used throughout this video. So ideally, I would have installed these gutters earlier in the project, as you can see what a lack of gutters will get you. I had tons of water build up around the foundation of the house, some soil eroding where the water was landing after running off the roof, and I also ended up with some staining on those brand new retaining wall cap blocks from the roof runoff. So needless to say, it was time to get some gutters installed. And when installing gutters yourself, you've got a few options, the first of which is to assemble your gutters from the standard link sections available at your local home center. And this is an okay option, but there are a few issues with this method. First of all, these gutter pieces usually only come in 10-foot long sections, so on this 49-foot long tiny house, for example, I would have had 4 seams where the gutters met up, which I would have had to carefully seal to avoid leaking in the future. And besides the potential for leaks, these joints also just make the gutters look worse, in my opinion. The other choice for gutters are seamless gutters, which, as the name implies, are run as one single piece. So obviously this eliminates any potential for leaking along the length of the gutter, since there aren't any seams, plus this lack of seams gives the gutters a super clean look. Now typically this style of gutter is really only available to gutter professionals, since these lengths of gutters need to be run on site with a very specialized machine. That said, after looking around in my area here in Asheville, North Carolina, I found a company called DIY Guys Gutter Supply, who specializes in providing the seamless gutters needed for a DIYer. And this allowed me to use these seamless gutters on my installation. So one other advantage to using this kind of gutter was the variety of gutter profiles I could choose from. And I ended up going with this European box profile, which I think looks great compared to the traditional K-style gutter. And it was kind of crazy to see a 49-foot length of gutter pop out of the back of a van. After the pieces were run, Eddie and I carried them to the backyard to get them prepped to be hung on the house. And generally speaking, you want to do as much of the work on your gutters as possible on the ground, since it's both easier and safer than trying to do the work up on ladders. So the first thing we needed to do was get a downspout adapter installed at each end of the gutter, and this is where the downspouts attach to the gutters, allowing the water to flow from the gutters into the downspouts. So to figure out where this downspout adapter needed to be installed, I measured the distance between the end of my roof and the corner trim on the house, since these downspouts will be mounted to this corner trim. And I transferred that location onto the gutters, and then I could get to cutting the hole. I figured out that a 3-inch hole saw created an almost perfect hole for these adapters and left me with a much cleaner opening than using aviation snips, plus it was just a lot faster to just drill the hole. Once the hole was drilled, I added a heavy bead of Titebond gutter sealant, since these connections need to be watertight, and then I set the downspout adapter in place and added a few white self-tapping screws, which could be driven in with this V20 impact driver with a 1/4-inch nut driver bit. And one tip here, I found that starting the screws from the top and then backing them out and installing them from below made things much easier, since I could make sure I was driving the screws into the mounting flange on the downspout adapter. Next, I could repeat a similar process to install the end cap, which seals off the ends of the gutters. And once again, these were installed with more gutter sealant and self-tapping screws. Once the end cap was installed, I came back and added more sealant to the inside of the connections, and I kind of went overboard here, as I really don't want these gutters leaking in the future. With that, one end of the gutter was done, and I could repeat the whole process again on the other end. The last thing to do before getting the gutters mounted to the house was to add the mounting brackets, as again, it's much easier to do this on the ground. And one end of these brackets hook under the rolled lip on the top front edge of the gutter, and the other end slips over the flat non-rolled edge. I laid out the brackets so they'd line up with the rafter tails on the tiny house, as otherwise the mounting screw would have protruded through the back of the subfascia and been visible, since we have this exposed rafter tail detail. Next, it was time to get the gutters mounted, but first let me illustrate where your gutters should be mounted with this scrap offcut. So when mounting your gutters, you want to picture an imaginary line coming off of your roof. And you don't want your gutters to intersect this line, as otherwise you can have problems with ice sliding off of your roof and damaging your gutters.
Cool.
With the positioning sorted out, I could finally get the gutters mounted to the house, which was a pretty simple process. I started in the center, pushing the gutter up as high as possible against the drip edge, and then I drove in the mounting screw into the subfascia and the rafter tail. From there, I could work my way out from the middle using a level to check that the gutters were sloped for proper drainage. I could also use our subfascia as a bit of a reference point here, since it should be level as long as the rest of the house was built level. And we just continued working our way out from the middle of the house from there, and while we do that, I want to take a second to thank Craftsman again for sponsoring this video. And as you've probably seen, I've been using these Craftsman V20 tools for a few years now, and overall they've been great. Craftsman offers a full line of cordless power tools in their V20 line, which also includes some cordless lawn and garden tools. So if you're looking to upgrade your cordless power tools, make sure to check out the links to all of the Craftsman V20 tools I used in this video, all of which are available on Amazon in the video description below. Thankfully, we had a pretty good rain the following day, so we could verify that our gutters were sloped properly, which thankfully they were, but you could also just use a hose to add some water towards the center of your gutters to make sure they're draining properly before moving on. And you really don't want a ton of standing water in your gutters, as the added weight could cause damage to them over time. Next, we could get the downspouts installed, starting with the elbow, which points the downspouts towards the house. And once again, this was installed with those self-tapping screws, but no gutter sealant was needed here, since the elbow overlaps the downspout adapter enough that water can't work its way outside of this seam. Once the elbow was installed, we needed to measure for the piece which would connect the two elbows, spanning the distance between the gutters and the corner trim. And Eddie held the downspout with the elbow installed in place, and I took a measurement, making sure to account for the overlap between the two pieces. To cut this piece, I used this awesome new Craftsman V20 brushless angle grinder, and I think it's become probably my favorite angle grinder for one big reason. The tool for changing your discs is stored right in the handle. And why I've never seen this feature on a grinder before is beyond me, but this makes installing and changing discs super convenient. Anyway, after installing the cutoff wheel, I got the length marked out on the bottom end of the downspout, and then made my cut, which was super simple since these gutters and downspouts are made of aluminum. Next, I got the piece added to the elbow, making sure the uncrimped end on the new piece overlapped the crimped end on the elbow. And the crimped end always needs to be on the inside of the next piece lower in the run to make sure the water flows into the next piece without leaking. Once that piece was added, I could measure for the length of the downspout, which I wanted to end at the bottom of the corner trim at this end of the building. My measurement was from the top of the newly installed piece, and so to mark the length on the downspout, I measured from the top of the elbow, since I knew those two edges would match up in the final installation. After marking my cut location, I got the downspout cut to length, and this time, instead of trying to connect multiple cuts, Eddie just slowly rotated the downspout while I held the grinder in place, and this resulted in a much cleaner cut. Before attaching the downspout, I needed to go ahead and get these downspout bands attached to the corner trim, as they wrap around from the back of the downspout. And we used 2 of these bands per downspout, making sure to install the upper band below the seam between the elbow and the downspout to fully support it along its length. Next, I could get the elbow connected to the connector piece, or at least I could try to. So for whatever reason, the crimping on this piece wasn't quite enough to allow these pieces to connect, but thankfully the DIY guys loaned me this gutter crimper, which made quick work of adjusting that crimping. Once that was done, I could get the pieces connected, making sure the downspout was centered on the corner trim, and then I attached the band to the downspout with more self-tapping screws. I repeated the process at the bottom of the downspout, making sure it was plumb, and with that, my downspout was installed. Now, one thing I'm not going to cover in this video is adding in-ground drainage to divert the water from the downspout away from the house. And that's because I'm still waiting on my sewer line to be installed, and this downspout drain pipe would be in the way of the sewer line installation. Also, your particular drainage setup is going to be highly dependent on your house and property, so just do your research, as there are a ton of options when it comes to gutter drainage. There are various drain pipe options, including PVC and black corrugated pipe, as well as choices on how you terminate your drainage, which include perforated pipe, a dry well, pop-up drain, and a bunch of other options. Anyway, the last thing to do to finish off the gutter system was to install some leaf guards. And leaf guards are definitely optional, and if you don't have any tree coverage above where you're installing your gutters, you probably won't need them. But considering my backyard is basically a forest, these were a necessity for me. So the leaf guards were fairly simple to install. We just started at one end of the gutter and got the leaf guard attached with a few self-tapping screws. And I'll still need to clean off these leaf guards once or twice a year, especially in springtime when there's a ton of stuff falling from the trees, but these should definitely help to keep my gutters from clogging. So as you can see, one end of these leaf guards are notched so that they can overlap, and I just made sure to overlap them properly before attaching the next section. We repeated the process down the rest of the gutters, cutting the last section to length, and once that was done, I could call this gutter installation complete. All right, hopefully you guys enjoyed this one. Installing these gutters definitely was not the most fun part of this whole house build so far, but I'm really glad to have them done because obviously we needed some water control here around the house. So stay tuned for next week's video where we'll finally be getting back inside the house to get things finished off, installing the drywall, getting the insulation in, and then from there it'll be all of the rest of the finishing, putting up the plywood walls, doing all of the bathroom tiling, all of the other projects that are left in the house. I know a lot of you guys have been asking when this whole series is kind of expected to be done, and right now I'm shooting for October, and while that might sound like a ways away from now, just consider that I'm going to be building all of the kitchen cabinetry myself, all of the other furniture and cabinetry throughout the house myself, so those things are going to take a little longer than they might typically, but I think the finished house is going to be pretty awesome because of that. So if you guys don't want to miss out on the rest of the series, go ahead and get subscribed and ring that little notification bell so you don't miss the future videos. I'll also have links to all of those Craftsman V20 power tools I use down in the video description below in case you want to check those out. And last, I want to say a huge shout out to all of my supporters on Patreon and my YouTube members. You guys are awesome. I'll have links to both of those programs somewhere here on the screen. All right, thanks for watching, y'all, and until next week, happy building.